I guess Saturday morning, yesterday morning, we gained a life. So it's a cycle of life. One person passes and one person is born, and what we have to look forward to as Christians is eternity, a life that does not end. This lesson is a created creatures lesson. I had intended to do this morning because Cynthia, last Sunday, we had done a created creatures lesson, and Cynthia had said she really enjoyed the created creatures lessons. Did I have another one that maybe I could do this week? So I had intended to do this lesson. I have not done this lesson at this congregation before, although it is an old lesson. And this time of year especially, you can hear we call them peeper frogs. I don't know if they've got anything like these in Boston, Dennis, but you maybe somewhere in a ditch someplace there might be a frog in Boston. But around here, this time of year, as the temperature begins to warm, these little frogs come out. And especially when I was growing up, we had you might call it a pond. We called it a mud puddle. But where my parents had dozed out for our house, there was a low place with a spring in it. And it filled with water, and we called it the back mud puddle. And I grew up thinking that everybody had a back mud puddle. And these little frogs had lots of cattails and things. And these little frogs would fill that pond. And this time of year, it would get so loud that my mother could not hear to talk on the telephone. They would be so loud, singing their little songs in the evening. So I grew up with peeper frogs. And this time of year, as peepers come out and we begin to hear them singing in the rushes and the cattails and the swampy places, it just reminds me of his creativity. These frogs are one of the first signs of spring. Their song begins, and I know spring is coming. Warm weather is coming. It'll be time to plant. The University of Michigan describes their peeping as, quote, as cheerful as the sound of sleigh bells. And I'm inclined to agree with that. It's just a very cheerful sound. Now, of course, you might wonder what this might have to do with Christians. And we'll get to that in just a moment. The University of Michigan also states that their cheerful sound can be heard as far away as 2.5 miles. Now, for a frog that is not much bigger than my thumb, I would say that's quite a feat to be heard 2.5 miles away. You think about how long it would take a frog the size of my thumb to hop 2.5 miles away. But their song can be heard that far away. So what do we get from peepers? When we see this little created creature, or you may not see this little created creature, we'll hear them, but a lot of times we don't see them. So there's 3 lessons that I want us to remember when we hear these little created creatures. But before we get into those 3 lessons, I want us to go back to the book of Romans, and I want to remind us once again. When I do a created creatures lesson, I always try to go back to the book of Romans chapter 1. Because the Apostle Paul tells us there are 2 ways that we can know about God. And the first is obvious. The first is studying the Word of God. And we learn about God through His Word. But what would happen if you didn't have a Bible? Would you be at loss? Certainly that would be a great loss to us. But we can still learn of the existence of God even if we don't have a Bible. Because the Apostle Paul says in Romans chapter 1 and in verse 20, Paul says, for the invisible attributes, namely His eternal power. So God's eternal power and divine nature have been clearly perceived ever since the creation of the world in the things that have been made, so that they, being mankind, are without excuse. In other words, when we stop, pause, and consider the creation of the world, God's little created creatures, the mystery that surrounds them, the beauty that surrounds us, we realize that there must be a God. We realize that none of this, I don't believe that anything comes from nothing. Something, everything, every substance that we have came from something. You know, one person said that all human beings have ever managed to do, we've never managed to actually truly create anything. All we do is move material from one place to the other and change forms. In other words, the clothes that I'm wearing one time were probably petroleum that was pumped out of the Middle East or Russia. Hopefully it was pumped out of Ohio or Pennsylvania, but, maybe West Virginia. But I would say in all likelihood, the clothes that I'm wearing are made from, they're made from petrochemicals. You think about the pews on which you're sitting this morning. Those one time stood in a forest somewhere. They're made out of wood, made out of trees. Mankind cut those trees down, and we sawed those trees up into boards, and the boards were then made into the pews on which you're sitting. And so we've really not created anything. We've taken something that God has created, and we've moved it to a different location. The windows in this building, one time those windows were primarily sand. The glass in those windows comes from sand. And there's some other ingredients come together, and it's melted, and it becomes glass. But we didn't invent the sand. We didn't create the sand. All we took was something that God had already created, and we made something else out of it. We just transferred it into a different form. So it's my opinion that man does not invent or create anything, but that God has given us everything that we have. In one of Peter's letters, Peter says he's given us all things that pertain to life and godliness. So now, back to spring peepers. 3 lessons we can learn from the peeper frog. First is optimism. And I don't know about you, but I believe following Cynthia's death on Wednesday, I believe that this congregation needs a shot of optimism, because we're going to feel her absence very keenly. And so it's going to be easy for us. I've already felt it myself, a little sense of depression, that smiling face wrapped in sweaters, even on warm days, is not going to be with us anymore. So let's think about optimism. The second is a joyful sound. If we are optimistic, then we have a responsibility, as the peeper frogs do, to make a joyful sound unto the Lord. And the final lesson we can get from the peepers is to spread the optimism and spread the joy all around. So let's get into this. First of all, optimism. I believe that our outlook on life is a choice. I believe the Bible teaches that. When we're depressed, oftentimes, now there is chronic depression, and certainly that is real. But I believe that a lot of our attitude and outlook on life is the choices that we make. I can choose to be sad. I can choose to be happy. And I can choose to be optimistic. In the face of all the odds, I can choose to be optimistic. Or I can choose to be pessimistic. The choice is mine. The question is, which are we? Which one are you? You might think that it is determined by your circumstances, but it's not. To be optimistic is a choice that we make every morning when we get out of bed. To be optimistic is something that we have to decide. An optimistic sees adversity as temporary. I see the challenges that we face as temporary. It doesn't matter what the challenges are. You know, I had a good friend who was a doctor. He is a doctor. And Dr. Davis looked at it this way. He said, all pain eventually ends. All temperatures eventually go down. In other words, he had Dr. Davis had a rather interesting sense of humor when I was around him a lot. And his sense of humor was, all pain will eventually end, even if it's in death. And all temperatures will eventually go down, even if it's in death. And so, you know, I'm sitting here, okay, you're in the medical profession. I'm not sure I want you working on me too much, but it's a perspective. I want us to go into the book of Matthew chapter 6. In Matthew chapter 6, we studied this not very long ago. In fact, just a couple weeks ago. Our Bible reading was in Matthew chapter 6. And I want us to look at something that's found in verse 27 of Matthew chapter 6. Bear with me this morning. I'm a little groggy from lack of sleep and slightly slow. But I finally made it to Matthew chapter 6. I want to go down to verse 27 of that chapter. And we studied about anxiety here, and so I don't want to dwell on this, but I do want to touch on this. Jesus says, and which of you by being anxious can add a single hour to his span of life? So what I want us to see here is that Jesus says there's no point in being pessimistic. There's no point in being depressed about something. We can't change our situation in life, is what Jesus is saying. And why are you anxious about clothing? Consider the lilies of the field, how they grow. They neither toil nor spin. Yet I tell you that Solomon in all his glory was not arrayed like one of these. But if God so clothes the grass of the field, which today is alive and tomorrow is thrown into the oven, will he not much more clothe you, O you of little faith? And I want us to drop down just a little bit into verse 34. Jesus says, therefore, do not be anxious about tomorrow. For tomorrow will be anxious for itself. In other words, Jesus says the anxieties we have today don't need to transcend into tomorrow. The anxieties that we will face in the future, we need not worry about today. The optimist will look at that, and the optimist will say, tomorrow will be better than today. And the optimist will say that I need not worry about the problems of the future. We go back into Ecclesiastes. Ecclesiastes chapter 7 and verse 10. Ecclesiastes chapter 7. Solomon says, down in verse 10 of that chapter, Solomon says, say not, why were the former days better than these? I grew up around a lot of old folks. A lot of folks will say, you know, it's the good old days. You've heard that said. Friends, I don't know about you, but I do enjoy talking about the good old days. I do enjoy listening to stories that my family tells of the past. Well, let me tell you something about the good old days. My grandparents, in the good old days, didn't have toilet paper. They used corn cobs. Yes, Ruth, they did. They used corn cobs because they didn't, you know, and if they were lucky, they had the Sears and Roebuck catalog, and it was cut into squares, so they didn't have to use corn cobs. And I remember my great-grandma Bach. she never had an indoor bathroom. Those were the good old days. Corn cobs at below zero in the outhouse. Oh yes, I want to go back. Better were the former days. No, I like indoor plumbing. I like quilted northern bath tissue. I like a toilet that flushes. I like to do my business where it's 65 degrees or more. I don't care to go back to all the things of the good old days. You know, I remember my grandmother, Grandma Anderson, talked about the good old days, but she remembers growing up in the years of the Depression. She said, yeah, we didn't have anything to eat but green beans. My Grandpa Anderson talked about the good old days and growing up in the Depression. He said, we had 3 meals every day. We had fried mush for breakfast. No, we had, I'll get this right, fresh mush, corn mush for breakfast. We had fried corn mush for supper. And we had cornbread for dinner. So they had corn, my grandmother had green beans. Grandpa said we had 3 meals a day. Mush, mush, and more mush. Solomon says the good old days aren't necessarily all that great. You know, the optimist gets stuck in the thinking that the best days are behind us. Or not the optimist, the pessimist gets stuck in thinking the best days are behind us. The optimist thinks the best days are ahead. And I think that's what I like about the spring peeper frogs. They remind us winter is over. Cold is ending. Now, I know it doesn't look that way today. Snow's, little flurries coming across the sky. But you know, tomorrow it's supposed to dip down tonight. We'll probably have some ice on the pond. The peeper frogs won't be out. But Wednesday we're supposed to have a high of about 79 degrees. And they're going to be out and they're going to be singing their chorus, calling spring, looking for other frogs to enjoy the spring weather with. An optimist lives by faith. We'll go back into the book of Hebrews for a moment. Hebrews chapter 11. The optimist, the Hebrew writer says, lives by faith. This 11th chapter of the book of Hebrews is oftentimes referred to as the book of faith or hall of faith. But I want you to take notice of what he says in verses 5 and 6. Hebrews 11, verse 5, the Hebrew writer says, by faith, Enoch was taken up so that he should not see death. And he was not found because God had taken him. Now, before he was taken, he was commended as having pleased God. And without faith it is impossible to please him, for whoever should draw near to God must believe that he exists and that he rewards those who diligently seek him. The optimist will look at that and he will say, I must draw near to God. He will look at Enoch and he will say, Enoch was one who was shortly after Adam. We can read the genealogy in the book of Genesis. But the optimist looks at that and says, I've got to have faith in God. I've got to have faith in order to conquer the world, to overcome sin. The pessimist would look at that and say, it's impossible. We can't do that. None of us can live a perfect life. But the optimist will say, I must try. And so you see the little frogs sometimes come out early, before today. Days like today, well, that's just a temporary setback in their lives. Cold days will drive them back in, and the minute the pond thaws out and the weather is warm, they'll come out and sing God's song again. And in Revelation, if you'll go back to the very last chapter of Revelation, the very last chapter in the Word of God, chapter 21 of the book of Revelation, I want you to notice something that is said in verse 3 through 5. next to the last chapter of the book of Revelation. Revelation 21:3. And I heard a loud voice from the throne saying, Behold, the dwelling place of God is with man. We just sang songs this morning about heaven. We sang, This world is not my home, I'm just a passing through. My treasures are laid up somewhere beyond the blue. We sang about that, and John is giving us here the place that we're singing about. He says, Behold, the dwelling place of God is with man. He will dwell with them, and they will be his people. And God himself will be their God. And he will wipe away every tear from their eyes. Oh, we also sang No Tears in Heaven this morning too, didn't we? See, those two songs are based on this passage in Revelation. God will take away every tear. We have to believe it. The optimist believes and hopes to reach this place. He will wipe away every tear from their eye, and death shall be no more. Neither shall there be any more mourning, nor crying, nor pain any more, for the former things have passed away. The anxieties of the world, the depression of the world, those things exist in this life. They do not exist in eternity. God will take away those things from our lives. Pain, suffering will all be gone. But only the optimist is capable of doing that.